Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the first session this afternoon after lunch. It's the most difficult one, always. Yeah, it's always the most difficult one. So my name is Sarah Chiumbu. I'm associate professor at the University of Johannesburg School of Communication. I was here at Wits for 7 years. So this is home. So it's nice to be back. So the topic of our discussion, research-driven teaching in a decolonizing Africa. But what research? So there have been calls for journalism education to be driven by research, but what research is needed? I think this is a conversation that already started in the morning. I think Leslie Cowley here brought it up in one of her interventions, and Anthea as well discussed it as well when she was responding to Hayes, and other people also referred to this particular issue. So now I think we are going to go into a bit more detail about what can be done. But before we even start, I just want to ask whether Nelson, oh, hey, there he is, yeah, okay. Nelson, hi. You can hear us?
Everyone, yes.
Okay, okay, all right, thank you. So we've got the people who are going to discuss this topic. We've got 3 people is per program there. So the first person will be Mr. Enoch Sithole. He works for the Wits Centre for Journalism. So I'm told that he's going to give a report on research trends into this topic. And he emphasized to me that it's a very brief, very short report. Then I'm going to ask Nancy, Prof. Nancy Buka from Aga Khan University, Nairobi, Kenya, to come second with the interventions. Then I'll end up with you, Prof. Nelson Okorie, who is online. So I think we can kickstart. I think as what was said earlier, this is a discussion more than anything. And I think we are now picking up where we left off in the morning. So, Mr. Enoch Sithole, over to you.
Thanks, Professor. Mine is going to be a very short one indeed, because I am sort of taking a look at what research, broadly speaking, is taking place on the continent. So I looked at 2 conferences, basically the papers that have been delivered and are going to be delivered tomorrow at SACOM. I looked at the East African Communication Association conference that took place a little over a week or so ago. And so I looked at what papers were being delivered there and what themes, research themes, were being covered. It's interesting that the 2 conferences, the EACA conference and SACOM, they both went on the digital technologies theme. The EAC1's theme was media and communication opportunities, lessons learned, and challenges for innovation technology during Corona pandemic or the Corona pandemic. I looked at 58 papers that were submitted for that conference. 27 of them had digital technologies topics. So that tells you that there is a lot of interest among researchers to look at issues that concern digital technologies. Social media, among those 27 papers, comes out very strongly. If one takes from this morning's presentation from Dr. Hayes, it's clear that there's a lot of concern about what he called the peripheral journalism. There were other issues, though, that were touched on. There are issues of journalism, communication, and education, journalism, communication, education, and training, women in the media, etc., etc. But they also looked briefly at issues of climate change, which is very close to my heart. But by and large, the EACA conference looked at digital technologies in many respects, including their role in COVID-19, their role in e-governance, their role in the negative role that it also plays, for example, is in cyberbullying, gender-based violence, etc. SACOM that takes place tomorrow, from tomorrow, I looked at it as well. It had over 70 papers that touch on digital technologies. The papers are real wide-ranging. There are many issues that are touched upon there regarding digital technologies, talking both in relation to the advantages that the ICT brings to the media and communication sphere, as well as the challenges such as cyberbullying, facilitating gender-based violence. It comes to education as well, what the technologies bring to education. So the papers there are varied. They are all over in terms of issues within the ICT area. They also touch on issues of television content. It still comes up very strongly. They come to issues of training, journalism, education, and training. They touch a lot. They go back to the issues of COVID-19, how COVID-19 was communicated. So the topics really are diverse, but they are within those few categories dominated by digital technologies. The titles are very exciting. I'm sure you will hear some of them from tomorrow. My most interesting one is the title of a paper called #FoodSec SA Media. For those who don't know FoodSec, it's a rude way of saying go away. So I don't know what that is about. I'm sure we'll hear more about it tomorrow. The papers also touch on issues of gender issues, media in the media, women in the media, etc., etc. But the dominant theme, as I said, is digital technologies. My only gripe is that no paper in the SACOM papers talks about climate change. Thank you.
Are you sure you looked properly?
I did.
Thank you so much. No, I think the research that you've just presented, as brief as it is, I think it's very interesting actually to look at what kind of papers these conferences are bringing up, and I think it will also be interesting maybe to go to do a comparative of SACOM and the East African Communication Association conferences over maybe the past 10 years to see the movement of ideas, because I will not be surprised that probably 10 years ago, the discourse was around issues of ethics and Africanizing ethics because of the debates that were there around that time. So it will be interesting to see what has been happening over the last years in terms of movement of ideas. So, but I think we'll talk about your research later on. So I'll move on to Prof. Buka.
Thank you. So my comments will be drawn from my experience at the Aga Khan University's Graduate School of Media and Communications, where our students, in the Master of Arts in Digital Journalism, are required to complete a research thesis, of course, with a lot of struggle. for the most part, many of them would prefer to work on a project as opposed to, a final thesis, a thesis as the capstone project. But also from, my experiences with the media industry in Kenya and in East Africa, and as one of the founding members of the East African Communication Association. It's interesting, Enoch, as you were speaking, the emphasis around digital technologies, COVID-19 seem to be the areas where a lot of research is focusing on at the moment. And I remember, I think last year, it got to a point where, we told the students, we don't want to see COVID-19, as on your concept notes. I think there was too much emphasis, and granted, but I think, at the expense of a lot of other things that were happening, within the media space that warranted some attention. So in addition to, just understanding the digital technologies and how they impact various aspects of media, one of the other things that I see a lot is a lot of research around audiences and trying to understand audiences and how audiences engage with content. And then there's quite a bit of content analysis, particularly print content analysis. And it's interesting that a lot of the studies on print, a lot of the studies on content analysis are focusing a lot more on print. And yet, we say that a good number of our audiences have moved from print. So it appears like it's a safe space for, a lot of emerging researchers to go to, as opposed to trying to understand, what does that content look like, for example, on social media platforms. And then again, I think I've also, seen quite a bit of research on, issues in media, the gender issues in media, working in distributed newsrooms, understanding, the new platforms, sexual harassment in the media space, so those are quite, sort of this breadth of topics or research that you see. And, I think in trying to answer the question, what sort of research is needed, for me, it goes back to something that Schedule has talked about, I think, in previous publications, that looking at research that understands the particulars, what he calls the particulars, of the African space, understanding the cultural and the local context. But also more importantly, it's how that research then informs practice. And I remember one of the worst questions when I did my PhD is that after all was said and done, one of the examiners asked me, what's the contribution of this, to the African media or to the Kenyan media? And it's not one of those questions that you think about. You can talk about it in very abstract terms, but I think just asking about, how are you going to pay this back to the industry? What can they take out of this? And I think that should be something that a lot of the research that we're doing, or our students are doing, should be able to ask or should be able to interrogate or bring out. And I say this because whereas, we go to the media to understand the particulars of the media in terms of the context and the cultures within the newsroom, I think the reality is that a lot of media organizations and newsrooms are looking to us to be able to also predict, what are some of the things that will be happening to them, in a year's time. But a lot of the research seems to be one that is not predicting, but is basically just addressing the current issues as they were. And I say this because one of my students has, just completed his thesis on artificial intelligence in newsrooms in Kenya. And, I worked with him to get that paper published. We finally got it published about 2 months ago. And he works for BBC, he's a news editor. And, just seeing the sort of traction that paper got in the media spaces. Now, we do quite a bit of research, but you don't get it shared in a lot of the media platforms. But just seeing, the speed with which that paper was shared within the media spaces, for me, said something. That one, I think the lesson was, this was a paper that was basically talking about, perhaps not where the media in Kenya is at the moment to a large extent, but what could be, with artificial intelligence. But the other lesson that I learned from that is that part of the reason why it was shared extensively is that it was not just academics, doing their research. The fact that this was somebody who works at the BBC, is an editor, gave the paper a lot more credence amongst the professionals, and they shared it quite extensively. In fact, encouraging each other, if they hadn't read it, to read it. And the interesting thing is that a lot of people now have come to ask for, the bigger document, and just to try and see, what is there that can be gleaned from it. And so, when we ask the question, what sort of research is needed and how might we go about it? I think there is, quite a great opportunity for those of us in the academy to work very closely with those who are, more or less on the shop floor in the newsrooms, to come up with research that then can inform a lot of the practices that that are happening in the newsroom. And those opportunities are there. Sometimes they know the questions, but they just do not know how to go about it, from a research point of view. The other thing that I wanted to say is that, sorry, how much time do I have anyway? The other thing is that, I think it's important that the research that we do also understands what are the critical issues in Africa, because journalism does not operate in a vacuum. It is part and parcel of a context. So what are those critical issues in Africa? Of course, realizing that those issues will be different from one region to another, from one country to another, but understanding what those critical issues are, would really help journalism in responding, to those issues when we finally are, are reporting or covering them. What sort of research is needed? One that does not lose sight of the realities of the newsroom. So it calls for a lot more deeper integration, between the academy and practice, research that helps in building and developing cases. And I say this because, we have quite a bit of, they don't want to be called veterans in Kenya. They want to be called mature journalists, or people who have spent quite an extensive time in the newsroom. And over the last 2 or 3 years, the newsrooms have actually been getting rid of them because they're expensive to keep. So what we've been trying to do at the school is to bring them back, not just in teaching, but also try and work with them to write cases that then would inform teaching. And that's a great opportunity for research, to be able to contribute, to journalism as a whole. So it's research that then helps in developing cases that can support, education. And in relation to that, we currently are doing a media tracking or a media monitoring review that we do for the Nation Media Group. And it's we submit a weekly report, and this report basically looks at how the Nation, in all its platforms, the print, digital, and broadcast platforms, carried various stories, and how they treated the stories, and in some cases, what was the sort of feedback that the audiences had or about the different stories that they carried, what was done well, what wasn't. Were there certain stories that had gaps that were incomplete? We also give suggestions of stories that they could follow up on. And we submit that report every week. We've just completed a whole year. So we have, 52 reports that we have sent to the nation. And we're just signing a new contract to begin another tracking for them. But the team that does that is not just made up of those in the academy. It is also, journalists who understand the operations, the current operations. They're not in the active newsroom environment, but they understand, what it actually means to pull together, a story, and they contribute to that sort of monitoring. So whereas it's not, by definition, what you'd call research, based on the frameworks that we use, but it provides some very rich data to inform our teaching, our education. We see where the gaps are just from, looking at what the nation has carried in the last 1 year. We see where the opportunities also lie. And it gives us such a great opportunity to sit at the table with them to discuss, how they might improve, their journalism. And so it's not by definition, what we would look at as a research paper, but it is research in and of itself, because it informs a lot of the things that we teach, but also a lot of the operations at the nation. And it's a great opportunity, through that we're able to just leverage the expertise that those of us in the academy bring, and also what those in practice would bring. I think I will stop there. I think one of the other things that I wanted to say is that, having been a founding member of IACA and still part of the board, is that I think when we look at research in the African space, there's also the question about where are we publishing and what sort of journals we're publishing in. And the greatest challenge for the East African Communication Association conference is, getting folks in that particular region to publish in the journal, the African Communication Journal, because there are questions about, is it peer reviewed? Are the articles peer reviewed? Who's doing the peer review? Is it what's the rating of the journal? What's the perception of the journal? And that has a bearing, in terms of us thinking about, how do we enrich research in the region? So if we have a journal, but we don't trust it as much as we do the Western journals, then that has an impact on, encouraging scholarship within the region, particularly for a lot of the emerging scholars, but also for some of those who have spent quite a bit of time in the academy, and whether that is the place that they would like to publish. And that's because sometimes when you look at some of the journals where we are publishing, the reviewers come with sort of a prescribed framework, that is very Western oriented. So where are the opportunities? If you're saying that this research must also bring with it, the particulars of the context, to what extent are we encouraging that in the publications that are coming out of the African continent? And therein lies an opportunity for us to try and strengthen some of the journals that are African by definition, and encourage a lot more colleagues to publish there. I know for a fact that the guy who's currently editing the journal is literally almost begging for papers, from time to time, and that does not mean that there are no scholars. There are scholars. They're just not thinking that that's where they should publish their papers. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Nancy, for a very interesting intervention and presentation. I think you mentioned two very critical issues, I think, that I would want us to discuss. I think the first one is the integration between research and industry. How should that look like? Because sometimes what happens in the research space and what happens in industry are completely different. We see the world differently. So how do we integrate these two? Then the last point that you just mentioned, the political economy of publishing. Because if you look at the topic we are discussing today, research-driven teaching in a decolonizing Africa, but what research? It's got a lot to the implications of this political economy of publishing comes into play. Where are we publishing? And what kind of papers are we publishing? Because sometimes when we are targeting the so-called international journals that our universities normally force us to publish in, they are not interested in certain kinds of papers. So we kind of self-censor ourselves to write a paper in a way that would be accepted, something that is probably not too radical or off the track from the usual way of doing things. So in a way, we shoot ourselves, in the foot by leaving out certain kinds of research. So I think we've raised a very important issue. I think that would want us to maybe to take further on in the discussion. Then I think we'll now move to our last speaker, Prof. Nelson Okorie from Pan-Atlantic University in Lagos, Nigeria, is online. So yes, so I'll give you the floor.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me, please? Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yes. So I'm going to be making my conversations with us will centered around what the first speaker has actually pointed out, talking about what the publications, the papers for the East African Communication Association and from the SACOM. Now, when I listened keenly to when he made his presentation about the number of papers, I just got two things that I could gather. Now, the two things, the researchers focused on the national development plans of these countries and the sustainable development issues. And these are two things we really need to really pay more attention. And we talk about digital technologies as a major driver for these two elements. That is the national development plan and the sustainable development issues. Most countries usually have their national development plan, especially in East Africa and Southern Africa. I know here in Nigeria, we have the national development plan between 2021 to 2025. And I know in South Africa also, they have a number of policies and plans that to address issues that are affecting them, issues that have to do with climate change, issues that have to do with water security and the likes. Then also in East Africa, they also have a number of policies and plans to address issues that have to do with food security, education, women, and a number of things, and health. And so if you look at this, you'll find out that from the national development plans and policies of these countries, they have a number of issues that are already integrated and they want to resolve these issues. Then we also have the sustainable development issues. Now we find out these sustainable development issues are in line with the sustainable development goals. We have the sustainable development goal on education. We have the sustainable development goal on health. We have the sustainable development goal on women. We have the sustainable development goal on agriculture. We have the sustainable development goal on marine ecosystem. So these sustainable development goals are actually local issues that many countries have identified, and they eventually turn them to sustainable development goals among 100 countries in the United Nations. And you find out that these are the issues now many researchers are actually focused on. And there's one thing that the SDG goal document usually emphasize. It said the media is a center to bringing about the goals, these sustainable development goals, and that is where digital technologies come in. Now, the question here is this: how can we turn all this to become research-based teaching? What we need to do is we need to incorporate all this that we have been doing, whether in SACOM, whether in East African Communication, or whether in ACCE, where I come from, African Council for Communication Education. We can actually incorporate this inside our curriculum. Because I know in recent times now we have UNICEF, IOM, International Organization for Migration. They've been advocating that these researches that we do should be incorporated in journalism education. because we found out that UNICEF is saying, look, we need to have a lot need to have a lot of what conversations. We need to have a lot of training and teaching in the area of child rights reporting, child rights research, and this needs to be incorporated in the curriculum. So when we are training journalists, when we're training media professionals, we need to emphasize issues that have to do with child rights issues. We talk about migration. We have issues of migration. We talk about internal migration, transcontinental migration, illegal migration. We talk about organ migration, a number of migration issues, as xenophobic attacks. So these are issues. And you find out that these things need to also be incorporated. And IOM, the International Organization for Migration, have been advocating that these things should be incorporated in our curriculum, journalism educational curriculum. So we need to ask ourselves this question. After we've done this research, how well can we incorporate this in our teaching? How well can we teach our students this? And there are different ways we can do this. One, from the student level. When we are teaching our students, we have to give them research-oriented assignments in line with these topics we have taught in class or the research we've done. So they can also do their own independent research and they can also further their knowledge. That is one way we can do this. Then two, with the practitioners level, we need to also, when we conduct our research, our outcomes, the findings of this research should be, used to train and retrain journalists and professionals, especially in cases like in my country here in Nigeria. We have cases of insecurity, we have cases of terrorism. Our findings of our research can be used to help journalists or media practitioners to understand how well we know the networking, the funding of these terrorists or these insecurity elements. So how well we can tackle them. So when this is done, they can know how to report this issue. So these are two things we really need to take. We need to take note, and that is what I actually could draw from the first speaker when he actually gave a brief about the papers from SACOM and the papers from EACA. But moving forward, the second speaker actually mentioned something, and she talked about publications, and I have some recommendations. The first recommendation I have here is we should have more student-based journals. Student-based journals, yes. Students from the undergraduate level, students from the postgraduate level, when they conduct their research, when they have their ideas, these things could actually be published in student-based journal. When I was a postgraduate student, doing my PhD, I actually published an article in a public knowledge journal. That journal is a student-based journal. And that particular journal, I have my highest number of citations. Then I've not really started into my research. So you see, at this point, when we have student-based journals in the area of journalism education, we find out that students, whether it's undergraduate students, whether it's master's and PhD students, they can actually write articles, which is not going to be too mechanical, not to be too technical. By the time they publish this article, their ideas, we'll read their ideas, and this is what their further researches in this light. Then the second aspect is we need to have specialized journals. Now, specialized journals in the area of journalism to these social cultural issues, we're just talking about digital technologies. I can tell you that we don't really have more journals that are specialized in the area of journal of digital technology. We don't have that. We can have Journal of Communication, we can have International Journal of Communication, African Journalism Communication, but we don't have journals that have to talk about digital technology, which is a major supplier of information on social cultural issues. So it's important for us to have specialized journals in this slide, Journal of Digital Technologies and maybe and development. So when we have this type of specialized journal, we can see that there'll be more conversations, there'll be more discussions, there'll be more research in this particular area. So it's very, very important. Then my last point I'm going to say here is, it's a big idea, but why don't we have our own indexing body? The last speaker was mentioning about issues we were talking about, okay, it's some journals in terms of the political economy, the politics of publishing these articles in a number of journals. Why can't we have our own indexing body? China have done it, and why can't we do it? So I think it's time we start having this conversation about having our own indexing body. Scopus is there, Web of Science is there. Why don't we have ours? I know Kodesha was trying to do something about this before, but we can actually start that conversation for having our own indexing body, so we can actually publish our ideas, and which can also help us in journalism education. I think I will stop here at this point.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Okorie.
Thank you, ma'am.
I think you raised very important issues. I think the first issue was that we do have existing research already that is there, and policies and plans. We need to find ways of integrating these into our teaching. So I think you were referring to, although you did not use the term, I think we're really talking about the, promoting civic or solutions journalism, journalism that talks about our issues, to do with health, the economy, gender, and things like that, and integrating what our governments are planning to do in the national development plans into what we are teaching our students and what also appears, eventually will appear in the newspapers. But you also talked about an interesting issue of student-based journals. I think this is a very good idea. I haven't heard seen any in South Africa, maybe they are there. But also linked to the student-based journals, I think you also talked about that we don't have enough journals anyway on the continent, or that deal with, African journalism. I think we can count them actually. I think African Journalism Studies, Journal of African JAMS, Journal of African Media Studies. Then we've got Comunicatio and we've got Comunicare based at UJ. So we can maybe mention 4 or 5 on the continent. They are not enough. So I think I'll open for discussion. We've got about 20 minutes or so, 18 minutes to discuss. Thank you.
Okay, I have a question, or rather suggestion, on research that could be done potentially on how communication caters for persons with disability, specifically those with hearing and visually impairment. Second point, how do we ensure a structure on how to govern and regulate artificial intelligence in journalism as a common good to deliver unfulfilled promises in journalism education? Thirdly, journalists and communication practitioners. We speak of press freedom, which relates to access to information for all citizens to receive factual and quality information. But when it comes to reporting on issues related to persons with disabilities, terminologies are often misused and not used in a correct manner to tell their stories.
You're very right on that point of people living with disabilities. I think there's need for a whole conference about language in minority groups. I think it was you, right? Second, yeah, you can go.
I have a question concerning climate change, but also concerning this matter of decolonizing Africa. We see an urgency in global media around issues of climate change. However, speaking from a decolonizing perspective and at Africa, and looking at pre-colonial African cultures and how we related as a people to our environment, we realize we generally had a consciousness of sustainability, environmental sustainability, and actually different kinds of sustainability, even gender equality and all of those things. So in the context of decolonizing journalism education and incorporating issues of climate change, I'm just throwing it out there to the educators that approaching this climate change thing from a Western point of view, we will continue to miss a lot of things. It's very limiting because when we look at it from a decolonizing our education, our journalism education, we realize that exploring research into how did we used to interact with our environment, we realize that there was a lot of consciousness to climate sustainability, environmental sustainability. Thank you.
Sisanda?
Very much to the speakers. This is very interesting. My question relates to some of the points that were raised around the trends in the media scholarship and how we tend to focus on content analysis and looking at what is rather than forecasting. And it's something that I've been thinking about and wondering, does journalism education and journalism studies as a field or discipline, however you look at it, have what it takes to answer the questions that the field or the industry is facing? So if you look at the situation in South Africa with the closure of newspapers, for example, is that a question that media scholars have what it takes to answer, or is there a need to look beyond ourselves and incorporate people in commerce and in IT to talk about AI and its impact, etc.? And then I think that brings me to the issue of where do we stand going forward as departments if what we are researching isn't looking at what is to come and isn't answering questions that have not yet been asked, which I believe is one of the purposes of research, not to look at what is, which is what we seem to be focusing on based on the analysis. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, I don't know who wants to take that one. Nelson, you are also, you can come in here. Yeah, so any of you.
You want to go first? I think the question around, do we have what it takes within journalism education to more or less predict the sort of direction that the industry is taking? And I can say, left on our own, we might not be able to do that. We could, point towards a certain direction, but I think this is an opportunity for us to bring as many people to the table, to have those conversations. And I guess it's asking ourselves, then who do we want to bring to the table? And how much of what they bring do we want to use as we predict that future? One of the things we've done, for example, with the Media Leadership and Innovation program that we run at the school, is that we realized that part of the challenge that we were having, even in delivering that particular program, was we left on our own, we were basically just regurgitating what for us has been a safe space. And so we brought in people from different sectors. And of course, with a very critical mindset in interrogating some of the things that they were saying and asking what could possibly be and building different scenarios. So we brought in people from the banking sector. We brought in, folks who work in crisis communications and risk communication. We brought in people who work in corporate governance. A very different audience. And some of the things that, we were told or, they were sharing with us about their own environments were very unsettling. So for us to be able to predict, I think we need to open up the space to listen, but listen with intent and listen a lot more critically about what we can take in and what we cannot. And I think it shouldn't be a challenge for us because journalism by its very nature, listens to a lot of people, to tell the stories that we tell and to shape the content and to write the stories, so we have an opportunity to leverage that listening part of our job, a critical part of our job, to also listen to, what are the ideas that are coming from other spaces, and how might that then inform or help us predict for the industry, the direction that it should take.
Nelson, I think.
Okay, yes, I will just make those a few comments in line with the last speaker's comment. Please, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so you see, we can't actually predict, like she have actually pointed out, we can't actually predict, but we can actually suggest, we can actually recommend, and that is the idea of research. When we carry out research, we can make some recommendations, and these recommendations can be looked into, and eventually when it's executed, then there'll be development, there'll be changes. For example, I know that there have been a lot of researches that have been done regarding water insecurity in South Africa and in other parts of Africa and other regions of the world. And there've been a major suggestion, groundwater as an alternative source of water supply. And that has not been brought upon. That is one thing that the current minister here in South Africa has actually pointed out and said, we're going to be using groundwater. We're going to be looking into groundwater as an alternative source. So you see, that is actually a product out of research. They couldn't actually predict, but they can actually suggest, which has now eventually turned to policy. Another example here is when CNN conducted a research in 2017, 2018 about modern slavery of Africans that moved from migration from Libya, from Nigeria, from Western Africa to Europe. Then many of them find themselves in Libya, and they then become modern slaves. They captured that. They did a research. From that research, they came up with a documentary. When that documentary came out, it led to what a public outcry, and they now a number of policies, even here in Nigeria, regarding issues like this. So you see, when we do research, when it's in line with practice, when it's in line with industry, it brings about changes. We may not necessarily be able to predict, but we can actually recommend. Those are my comments, please.
Thank you so much. Enoch?
I will comment about the question regarding climate change. And my view is that obviously it's common knowledge that there is a deficit when it comes to climate change communication, climate change, media reporting on the continent. And the point being made is whether when we eventually report about climate change, are we going to do the same thing of imitating or repeating what is said by the New York Times and the Guardian, when our issues in Africa regarding climate change might actually be different. For example, there's the issue of what needs to be done to fight climate change, and everybody says it's mitigation, which means reduction in emissions, et cetera, et cetera. But many African scholars or many climate change scholars are asking the question, cut emissions in Africa, what emissions? We emit 3.8% of the total world CO2 emissions. 3.8%. South Africa, of course, emits more than it should be emitting because of coal. But Africa as a continent emits less than some single European countries. Now, when we report about fighting climate change, I'm going to say what the New York Times says about cutting emissions in the US, or what some Chinese newspapers should be saying about cutting emissions in China or in India, where they are in double digits in terms of percentages of emissions. So we need to approach the issue of covering or reporting on climate change or researching on climate change communication based on our situation as Africa. We don't have the same problem of emissions as America and Britain and Europe have. So it's a very valid and interesting question that I thought will require much research, and eventually whatever comes out must be taken into the newsrooms so that we can have a proper debate about addressing climate change from an African point of view, from an African perspective, rather than just doing what will be done in India, in China, or in the West. Thanks.
France, anyone else? Yes. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, colleagues, for yet another really interesting discussion. I have a question for Enoch and a point. My question for Enoch is, in your looking at the papers that were delivered at these two conferences, you didn't highlight decoloniality as a theme. It didn't come up, or it comes up in a different way, or I was just curious about that. Because it seems such an important topic. Anyway, so it's a question. My point responds to some extent to this question of research as predictive, and yeah, where we're, you know, to what extent we have the tools, I suppose, to see where things are going. I feel really strongly that we know too little about the situation of African media currently, on which we would need to build, you know, predictions. I mean, I've been doing a little bit of work on sustainability issues, and there's this international writing about sustainability and business models and so on, drawing on media economics and all sorts of things. And there's an easy assumption that it applies in the global South. And I'm not sure that it does. I mean, there are two things that I don't think feature enough. Firstly, government advertising. I mean, in some African countries, government money is like 70, 80% of the media economy. Now, are we saying that those governments are putting the money in Facebook? I'm not sure. It's an empirical question. It affects papers like New Vision, right? So I think there is a need for real empirical research about what's happening with you know, media economies in different countries. It's very easy to point to Kenya, South Africa, to say, look, there are closures, there are jobs lost. But those aren't representative of every African country, you know? We need to disaggregate, I think, those pictures, and we need to look at particularly government finance. I mean, it's just an example. The other thing that I don't think is sufficiently taken into account in this discussion about sustainability is the speed and trajectory of digital transformation. You know, it's not the same. Digital penetration in our countries here is not the same as elsewhere. And we're not, and yes, it's changing, and it's changing quite quickly in some senses. But like FM radio remains a hugely important thing. And it's a mistake, I think, to jump past this transitional phase and just think about what the future may look like, even if it's in 20 years' time. I think we need to understand where we are now. And this is just one example. And I think there are many other examples about just understanding the landscapes better, the systems, economic, social, the use of digital media, audience reception, all of these different things. And then, you know, one has a basis to look at the future.
So it's the intersection of many disciplines which can be embarked. I think it was mentioned earlier, history, political science, language, cultural heritage, economy. And I was thinking, we're talking about research-driven teaching, so it could be multiple things. It could be teaching based on your findings from your original research on decolonizing Africa, on journalism practice within that context. So, and I was wondering, how far do you guys embark your students, not only for receiving that knowledge, but also for building together that knowledge, because obviously it's new territory for all of us. And I think we're much in an experimental phase. So do you embark your students on this? Because we're trying to do that at our university, and it is challenging, but exciting as well.
So I'll take, I think, 2 more. No, I think it was you first. Yes. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. I want to, no, it's not a question as such, but some few observations based on the presentations. And I want to say that from the keynote address, which set us off the idea of de-Westernizing, how we teach journalism as well as how we practice it is coming up strongly. So this time is about the research we do and how it reflects us. The first point is I want to be hard on all of us here as African scholars. How do we motivate ourselves to look back and then do what is organic to us? I'm saying this because I know that when colleagues present papers, research papers for review, or thesis for examination and so on, we are quick to refer them, well, use this theory, why didn't you use that theory from elsewhere, and all these things. You see, we are not really supportive. Someone is arguing, and I agree, that we should find ways of publishing in homegrown journals. Are we going to accept those journals and say someone should be promoted to an associate professor because the person has published here? These are the things we do to ourselves. And perhaps we have to start from now to have conversations to see how we encourage these things. Because, yeah, publication, who is the audience? You see, if we publish in foreign journals because they have names, how are they accessible to our classrooms, to the lecturers there who should read them and then make them available in the classrooms for teaching? That is the first issue I want to raise. We should think about that. Secondly, too, the panelists have done a great job telling us that research will feed into the classroom for teaching. I want to take a step by saying it should also inform program development. Because we are beginning to know that journalism is evolving beyond merely teaching students to have skills. The skill to write well, to report. These are basic skills that previously we were emphasizing. But now, in my country, we have realized, Ghana, we've realized that we should do knowledge-based journalism. So there are a lot of areas we are mentioning today. For example, migration issues, science. How do we communicate science? I was excited when Prof mentioned medical reporting. You see, it's a field. The journalist should understand, not that the journalist become a medical doctor, but should understand that field to be able to communicate that to other people. Environment, climate change, and so on. So we are developing journalism now that will straddle the skills and then a particular knowledge base. So as a first step, we are now in the process of rolling out 3 journalism programs. One, we say journalism and politics, so that we tie the skill to politics, so they should understand things about politics and be able to report it. That is the idea, as technically and as accessibly as possible for people to understand. Then journalism and sports, and then journalism and economics. We can go on, journalism and agriculture, journalism and the environment, and so on. That is the direction we should go, because these things reflect our own evolution and development. These are the things that our people don't understand when they go out there to, for example, participate in democracy, voting, and other things. So the media, the journalists have a lot of capacity to build, and we should start from what we do as research and feed that into the programs that we develop. Thank you.
Okay, I think we are a bit over time, so we are going to have a shorter tea break. Was it you, Andrew? Yeah, Andrew, Alan, and then Musa. Then I think we'll close. We'll give the speakers last words.
Thank you so much. Mine will be very brief. Maybe where we could also start, because sometimes talking about research, we might probably or some of the educators might think about the the long, laborious research processes that need time, that need funding to inform our teaching. But I think it could begin with, basic observational and desktop, maybe research, focusing on getting Afrocentric with, for example, the examples and illustrations we use in our lecture rooms. So we did a list of some of the books we use. And I guess that most of our books are Western based, published in the West. They come with Western illustrations, Western examples. And these are the same examples and illustrations that we bombard our students with issues or experiences that are far-fetched from their everyday lives. So if you could sit down and use it as a resource, but look at the illustrations they give in the books, and then look around our societies, our countries, and get examples that, or illustrations that can capture the same concepts, but with a local touch. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Sarah. Actually, earlier you mentioned civic and solutions journalism. No worries. And I think this idea of journalistic reform movement, so it's similar to the point I think it's just been made. There's a kind of an imperialism. I know that Deutsche Welle are kind of rolling out a constructive journalism course for their journalists across the continent, for example. Solutions journalism comes from America, so there's money around the Solutions Journalism Network to kind of do the same thing in Africa. I think it would be really interesting to ask the journalists who are being trained, what they think of that. What examples of constructive and solutions journalism are emerging, and how are those being shaped by our context? And is there any way of speaking back to those journalistic reform movements in Europe and America around what we've discovered about those things here, and possibly different, ways of doing it, different ways of seeing it, different ways of understanding it, and maybe audience research as well, what the perception of those attempts at those forms of those journalistic reform movements actually have been. And there's another group, a consortium of American journalism educators who've just put together a really amazing book called News for Us. So it's sort of citizen-centered news. Again, a kind of a reboot of the public journalism movement, but they're calling it relational journalism. And I just wondered, if there isn't sort of some scope there to think about African sociality, some of the points, that we've been making about decolonizing some of those Western concepts and giving them African content. What is African sociality, and how does that play out in African communicative ecologies? And how do we then do relational journalism or engaged journalism from an African perspective, understanding our particular take on sociality and so on. So I just wondered if, that there are these attempts being made and initiatives going on. Can we do research on how that is going, and, whether it's successful or not, or whether we can speak back to that in some way?
Thank you so much, Musa.
Sorry, I was saying that, sorry about that, we should sometimes we should not have an either or approach. That there are different kinds of research that we are going to be conducting. Some of that research is going to be predictive, and some of that is going to be descriptive, and some of it is going to be different. If, for example, you look in the South African situation, if you were to say the media is moving strictly to the digital space, there's a very influential newspaper in South Africa, the Daily Maverick. It started as a digital only. It now has a printed version. It just sort of, I don't know how that is going. I read a lot of isiZulu newspapers, and they're read by a number of people. They're scarcely available online. That is being read online. People buy the actual copy, share it among themselves, and all of that. Personally, I do not necessarily subscribe to the City Press as I do to the Sunday Times via the institution. I buy the physical copy when I'm in Durban, and because my neighbor, a retiree old man, expects that he will get a newspaper from me. So there's this whole sort of dynamics. And if I'm gone to Cape Town, he goes to my family home to look for the newspaper. So and all other newspapers, as much as I can read them, there's this other issue that there's an expectation that this is not a generalizable issue, but I'm just saying that maybe there are other things that we may want to look at in terms of how audiences are actually consuming the newspapers, because at the end of the day, the people that we haven't spoken about much here are the people who actually have to consume the content that is delivered through various platforms. So that is just one thing that I wanted to talk about. I can't remember what the other one was. Cool.
Thank you so much. I think we are over time, so I'll just give second each to the three speakers.
The issue of reality, there is a panel discussion based on a book that is going to happen at SACOM. There was no mention of that at ACA.
You managed.
1 second.
Oh, I think Rod put it very, very, aptly that a lot of that research then must also be based on African-based epistemology. Our ways of knowing and how knowledge is constructed. And, I think as Franz was speaking, I was asking myself, do we also then need to redefine research within the African space in the context of decolonization? What frameworks are we using to define research? And is that then acting as a hindrance in terms of the different ways of knowing that exist within the African continent that we are not considering as ways of knowing because of the way that we have been socialized and to think about research. And to answer your question, now that I think about it, how do we involve students when they come into some of the courses, particularly at graduate level? It's asking them what they want out of a course. And one of the things that I think works for me is I ask them what they want before I share the course outline. Because once you share the course outline, again, in terms of how we look at education, in this space is the teacher knows it all. And sometimes the teacher knows nothing. They just need to be guided by the students in the room to chart a direction. And that's has been an incredible way of knowing. And it's a form of research that we perhaps haven't taken very seriously.
Nelson?
Okay, I was going to respond to those two comments. The first one was, in agreement, we have programs that are actually specialized. Yes, we talked about digital technologies, we talked about artificial intelligence. We can actually come up with programs that link digital technologies, artificial intelligence, machine learning with what we are doing in the area of journalism. I'm full agreement with that. But I'm also, just a suggestion regarding publications when publications are local based or maybe student based, but are not actually indexed in high indexing bodies like Scopus or Web of Science. We need to actually forecast and say, if we're this journal that I'm going to, and it's a very, very rigorous journal, we have the editorial board that are very good, the team members, what they are actually publishing is actually good. There's a possibility in the nearest future it's going to be a high index journal. My example I'm going to give here is Online Journal of Communication and Media Technology. I published an article in 2012, I published an article in 2017, I published an article in 2019, and I published an article in 2022. Now in 2012, before 2012, I looked at that journal and it was not indexed in Scopus. It was not indexed in Web of Science, but it was a very good journal. And it was in digital technologies, in media and communication. When I published the article, I knew that subsequently in the future, that article will be indexed. By 2017, by 2019, that journal was indexed in Web of Science. The 2012, 2017, and 2019 article automatically became indexed in Web of Science. Now I published an article, I looked at the Scopus database, and I knew that this particular journal will actually hit the Q1. I published an article now, and it's now in Q1. So you see that if you look at that trajectory, that journal has a very, very good scope, and it was actually pursuing that direction. And I just decided to just follow with that journal, and eventually it's now in Q1. But starting up with that history, it had nothing like that. We can do something like that here in Africa. We can actually come up with journals, specialized journals. They may not necessarily be indexed now. We could start up with African Journal Online. We can start with any other indexed body. But when we keep on doing what we're doing, eventually these journals will be indexed, and eventually all those articles will be indexed. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our three speakers for a very interesting topic. As I said, we have eaten into our tea time. So please grab a cup of tea and come back at 3:30. Yeah, there's no need to go anyway. For the next panel. Thank you.